Hi, and welcome to today's City Club of Boise virtual conversation with Idaho's legislative leadership. I'm Bill Manny. I'm a past president of Boise City Club, and I am today's moderator. So I want to welcome our radio listeners who will be joining us via Boise State Public Radio on KBSX 91.5 and its affiliates throughout southern Idaho and northern Nevada. This program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel as well. Today's forum is made possible by our audience and for our audience in large part because of the City Club partners and sponsors. I'd like to thank some of those organizations and individuals that help make our mission of ensuring compelling conversations, engaged citizens, and a dynamic community possible. Our premier sponsor is Northwest Nazarene University and the NNU College of Business. Our annual sponsor is the University of Idaho. We also receive report from our forum series sponsors, AARP Idaho, Bank of Idaho, Climate Tech Corp, Echelon Group, Micron, Pacific Health Plans, Pacific Source Health Plans, Small Mine Development, and St. Luke's Health System. City Club of Boise also receives grant funding from the Idaho Humanities Council. Thanks also to our media partners, which include Boise State Public Radio, 670 KBOI, the Idaho Statesman, Idaho Public Television, and our university partners, BSU and NNU. Finally, I'd like to thank you, the members of City Club, for your support. And if you're listening today and you like the program and you're not a member, we urge you to join. So before we get started, I just want to go over a little bit of logistics. If you have a question for our panel, we'll be getting to them in a few minutes. And you have two ways to ask a question. You can leave it in the Q&A part of Zoom, or you can email the ever-ready Morgan Keating at City Club, and her email is morgan@cityclubofboise.org. And she'll get me the questions, and we'll get to as many of them as time allows. So, whether you agree with the way things turned out or not, no one can deny that this was an eventful, dramatic, and historic Idaho legislative session, if only because it was interrupted by a pandemic. And it lasted longer than any other legislative session in history. And we're not even sure if it's really over yet, right? Speaker Bedke could yet call it back into session. So the session included a startling ethics committee hearing on sexual assault and the departure of the accused lawmaker. The legislature made multiple attempts to restrict the powers of the governor and his ability to declare an emergency. And in the end, the governor went along with it. We had big income tax cuts, big money for highways, money for teachers, and modest property tax relief. And despite all of this, or maybe because of it, there's a bunch of counties over in Oregon that want to be part of Idaho. What's up with that? So anyway, here to walk us through all of that and more are the top two Republicans and top two Democrats in the Idaho legislature. I'm going to introduce them alphabetically and then ask them to respond in that same order. So Representative Scott Bedke of Oakley is Speaker of the House. Representative Ilana Rubel of Boise is House Minority Leader. Senator Michelle Stennett of Ketchum is the Senate Minority Leader. And Senator Chuck Winder of Boise, excuse me, is President Pro Tem. So thank you all for joining us and being part of this virtual conversation today. So I'm going to start with Speaker Bedke and just ask you if you could quickly tell us what do you think is the significant accomplishment of this session and the biggest disappointment in your eyes?
Well, I think that first of all, thank you for having us, Bill, and we need to get, we can do these in person now, you know. Anyway, I think when we look back 10 years from now, and I think we're going to look to the transportation package that we passed and the dedication of a portion of the sales tax revenue to go into our road infrastructure, and not just for the state system, but also for the local system, the highway districts, the towns, and the counties. I think that's a significant departure from the way we've done business in the past. And I think that will yield dividends down the road. I think that quietly we maintained our commitment to Idaho teachers and the K-12 system. We set a good budget there. And that, in addition to the ESSER money or the stimulus money that is coming in, I think that Idaho schools are in good shape that way as far as funding. I guess I'm a little concerned about the gap in improvement in the K-12, or excuse me, K through 3 reading, scores. We'll have to see how those come out. But I think that the transportation would have to be a high point. The reduction of the income taxes by 0.5% to the top marginal rate would have to be, keeps Idaho competitive. That is also extended to small businesses and large businesses as well. If you really push me, and as I look back through, when we have this conversation, 5 years from now, looking back, I'd have to say that the ethical lapses that happened with our members, and then every bit as bad was the how should we put this? Trying to excuse that bad behavior, and to try to find there's a saying that 2 wrongs don't make a right, but it seems like we're eternally in pursuit of that second wrong that makes the first one right, and that I think played out a little bit there in the legislature as well, to trying to excuse the bad behavior, and that the ends justified the means. That when we have this conversation five years from now, we're going to remember that, and I think that was those 2 facets were a low point in this session.
Okay. Minority Leader Rubel, same question.
Well, I'm going to give you roughly the photo negative of the response to my good friend, the speaker. While obviously the ethical lapses themselves were very disappointing, I actually was fairly impressed at our body more or less coming together in a bipartisan fashion to send the message that such lapses weren't tolerated. And I felt that the ethics committee really pulled together in a unanimous fashion to send a strong message that the Capitol is not a hunting ground. And obviously there were some lapses in terms of it wasn't completely across the board among our members, but I thought that it was reasonably well managed, and everybody rose above party to do what had to be done to eliminate some very bad behavior in the body. And I was pleased to see us do something on transportation. And there were some other things around the edges that I think were good. I'm very pleased that we raised the age, for example, of foster care to 21, something that's really important, because kids being kicked out of foster care on their 18th birthday is horrific. It's something that was leading to very bad results for our most vulnerable youth, and is something that we had been pushing for to have happen for many years. So that was great. Disappointments were many. I guess at the top line level there is I just felt we came into this session with such incredible opportunity. We had over a $600 million budget surplus. We had another more than $600 million in the rainy day fund, and we were getting over $1 billion in federal funds. We had more money than the state had ever seen in its existence. This was the year to do big things to help the people of Idaho. This was the year we should have finally put in full day kindergarten, which was really at the top of every task force's recommendations for many years in terms of how we're going to boost our lagging literacy. It would have solved a lot of property tax problems, frankly, because a lot of districts are having to pass levies to do full day kindergarten. Incredible opportunity, totally blown. Opportunity for pre-K. We're one of 4 states that don't have any pre-K, and something that's also a huge setback to low-income families and low-income kids, sitting there on a platter for us and slapped away. Heartbreaking. We finally had a chance to restore higher education funding, which had really never made up for the cuts from the recession era. And instead of boosting it, they actually cut higher education budgets. So, incredible blown opportunities on the education front across the board. Heartbreaking, given that we were literally awash in money. And what was even more disappointing was, on the tax policy front, in terms of what they decided to do with that money. There were, even if we decided, forget education, we don't care about education, we're just going to worry about tax cuts. There were so many ways to deliver tax cuts in so much more helpful a fashion than was done. I think we whiffed hard on property taxes. Every proposal that was brought forth, many bipartisan ones, were denied a hearing. The only one that was allowed to go through was 389, which was rushed through with almost no opportunity for public input. And it instantly became clear that it was causing public safety crises and was going to, cause a huge headache to our growing communities around the state. And the income tax cut, I thought, was calamitous. I mean, it's, much was said about how basically it took $400 million out of our general fund that covers education. Almost all the money went to the people who don't need it. Humongous cuts, $10,000 income tax cuts to those in the top 1%, $50 for those in the bottom 20% of income. So humongous reduction in revenue with very little going to those who need it. And it was in a sense a complete reverse Robin Hood. It robbed from the poor to give to the rich. It took the sales tax fund, the internet sales tax fund, and sales tax, as we all know, is a more regressive form of taxation that is more proportionately paid by the poor, relatively speaking, as compared to income tax. They took that and used it to give a giant income tax cut that, again, will predominantly benefit the wealthy. So I thought the way that tax policy was tackled was really regrettable. And I think it was all a function of a system we have that does not allow good ideas to be heard. So many good tax proposals, so many good education proposals were never permitted to see the light of day and were never allowed a hearing or a vote. And I think going beyond this session, that's a long-term procedural challenge that we need to tackle because it's leading to really poor substantive outcomes.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go to Senator Stennett. Same question to you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity for City Club. I really appreciate us being able to have a very clear vision of the differences we have about how we perceived how the legislative session went. I do want to, you had mentioned some of the things in your intro about how we navigated in the building, and I want to take the opportunity to say that having walked in at what we saw at the U.S. Capitol and what had happened in a special session, I was extraordinarily grateful for the good work of the legislative services and for our security, for not only helping us stay safe and having kept it respectful, at least within the public and out in the greater forums. We were pretty scrappy in our bodies, but to have allowed for an environment that we could do our work, which walking in we weren't real sure about. And so I want to give a shout out to them for having made the remote learning, the remote testimony and participation, which was extraordinarily helpful. And for us, to the best of our ability, be able to navigate, not a perfect science in an area of COVID, but for a long legislative session for us to have been able to be relatively safe was, I think, needs to be commended. Beyond that, I agree with Representative Rubel. I think the foster care being extended to 21 was extraordinarily helpful. I also think that the block grants for childcare are very helpful, knowing that childcare right now is so smacked with what's happened with COVID and has a direct impact on parents' ability to get back to work and the economics and keep kids in safe environments and being able to teach them. I mean, the snowballing effect of what had happened cannot be understated, I believe. So whatever we could have done legislatively, policy-wise, to help give a little bit of relief, I think was extraordinarily important. I would like to say that probably the disappointments, like Representative Rubel, were many, just because we were there an awfully long time to do potentially a lot of good policy with resources to be able to do that policy. And we waited to do any of it that the people of Idaho asked in the very last days of a long session. And I think my disappointments are at the top were the two initiative bills that passed. I think that they restricted the people's ability to have a voice in the legislative and political process. It is the most restrictive of those states that offer initiative referendum possibilities to their public. It allows for one legislative district to basically veto the will of the other legislative districts if a number of signatures is not gathered. And then on top of it all, to bring another initiative bill where if you are not standing on Idaho soil in order to sign those petitions, even though you're a an Idahoan and you're a registered voter, let's say you are working in business on extended contracts outside of the state, or having to work or study abroad, or they did fix it to allow for military, which was hugely important, to be able to participate in the initiative process. But you've eliminated a segment of society from even participating because they are doing their jobs and are elsewhere, and they have every legal right to be a part of that process. So I think the only two things the public can do directly to tell us whether they're happy with what we do or not are by their votes and by the initiative process. And to diminish their power, I think, was more than unfortunate going into the next phases of what politics is becoming. Beyond that, I agree with Representative Rubel. What we did as far as property tax was something, but I think it was negligible compared to what we could have. I'm not sure, given the amount that the majority of Idahoans will get back, which is under $100, is anything meaningful as far as property tax relief. And so we could have done much better. We need to go back and do better. The other thing that we talked about, having given some money to local governments at the very end, it was a very fragmented bill that had a lot of moving parts. And we saw that, again, we were punitive against local governments and how they can possibly do their emergency services or their infrastructure, or to run or to deal with the huge influx of population and the constraints of that population on these municipalities. And to the point where we've heard about Caldwell and Nampa and many others saying, I got to put a moratorium on this, because there is no financial way we can do this with what you just handed us. And I think that, again, is a disservice to the health and welfare and safety of our people on a local level. And it already exacerbated a very difficult period during COVID and trying to get feedback on the ground when we do have the resources to have done this well, and to make sure that all of our infrastructure is provided for, and we have a plan for the next 10 years, because this has got to work. Everything from healthcare to broadband. I have unstable connections in Ketchum, Idaho all the time. It's just more load than they can possibly deal with. And that's just true all over the state. And if we are to go forward doing telehealth or good education and making sure that people can communicate and we get back on our feet, we did relatively little for that type of infrastructure that was seriously needed.
Well, it's funny because you are often freezing while you speak, so I guess you have an illustration.
I tried to boost, right, but there. you can't boost zero to zero. No matter how you boost, you can't get a good signal, and I try. But thank you for your patience.
So we're gonna, last but not least, is the Senate President. So same question to you.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks to your audience. Thanks for the panel for participating. I thought we were going to keep our answers fairly specific to the greatest accomplishment and the greatest disappointment, but I'll use this as an opportunity to say I think the greatest accomplishments dealt with funding for education. I think the ability to give people income tax relief, and the people that pay the tax are the ones that should get the money back. I think that our state is able to give back the largest tax reduction in the state history. I think that's really something, and yet we used $1 billion of federal funds to help local governments, help local businesses, lots of really positive things from a financial standpoint. I think the fact that, yes, there's probably still concerns about property tax, but most of that's controlled at the local level. But I can assure you that myself as an individual, I'd love to have an 8% increase in my funding every year. So I think, you know, when you look at what we tried to do, we tried to send a message that the cities, counties need to come to the table, and they need to be part of the solution for property tax relief. A moratorium will just extend and enlarge the problem, because we only have a week or 2 week supply of single family housing now. So what do you think that's going to do to prices and assessments? So yeah, I hope that Nampa and Caldwell and maybe anyone else that's considering a moratorium really think through that. And now that they have their 8%, they can figure out a way to move forward in a positive way and meet the needs of their communities. But they need to come to the table. That's the message I think the legislature was trying to say is we're hearing about all the problems with property tax and it needs to have some reductions, some relief for people. So we need to deal with that. And we did give a homeowner's exemption up. We increased it 25%. We worked on circuit breaker. I think, you know, there's some good things that happen. I think when you look at the balancing of powers, as you said in your opening, I thought you gave a great opening, Bill, in kind of outlining what the legislature did. I think the balancing of powers issues, you know, that we all came in concerned about. Finally, the governor began to listen. I think we, as a legislature, began to realize there's ways we can work together with the governor's office and come up with some good solutions. And I think we were able to do that. I think my greatest disappointment is how many legislators are willing to follow the directions of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And to me, that's one of the biggest threats we have to our democracy in our state is we've got a small group of people that are very vocal, that are very aggressive towards anyone that doesn't agree with them. And they're willing to do and say anything they want to say to try and get rid of anybody. And in fact, if you'll listen to some of the rhetoric going on out there now, everyone in the Senate's bad. They got to get rid of the entire Senate before they can get their ideas advanced. So I think that's a huge threat to just the democracy in our state, the Republican form of government. So to me, that was one of the greatest disappointments.
All right, thank you. For our radio audience, you're listening to City Club of Boise virtual conversation with the legislative leaders of the Idaho Legislature. And for people who are watching now, please ask your questions. They'll get to me and we'll get as many of them to our panel as possible. A lot of great issues, a lot of great follow-ups there. I think maybe I'll begin at the end, which is, can you, and I'll start with the Senate with Michelle and then go to Chuck, and then I'm sorry, I shouldn't be using first names. I'll start with Senator Stennett and then go to Senator Winder and then Representative Rubel and Bedke. But what is the difference between an adjournment and a recess, and why does it matter? Why are you handling it this way? And I must say, someone else is. So that's kind of a basic primer for those of us who are kind of lay people. But here's one of our audience members say, how can your ability to call yourself back into session not be like workers determining they can give themselves overtime pay? So I think, why is this an issue, and what does it mean to the average person in Idaho? Senator Stennett first, and then Senator Winder.
Well, I agree with you. Much of the discussion we had, much of the debate, and I would argue probably a lot of legal advice, which not all of us were privy to the decisions that were made legally about doing this. But there was a definite difference of opinion in the legislature, not just across party, but bipartisan, about the optics of continuing on in the taxpayers' money to do something that looked like politicking rather than policy making, because a lot of this was a lot of political posturing. And so are we there? We spent with what was said is a lot of the legislative session was spent on who has the balance of power and who's in charge and who's in control, and who in something that is a natural disaster or an emergency, who would be the most nimble in making sure that people are cared for in the quickest period of time to put resources when people's lives are at risk. And I bring that up because the legislature demonstrated it is not nimble. It did not do anything nimbly. It did not make any quick decisions. When it wanted to do something about changing the balance of power, it took us all the time that we were there to get anything passed. There was a lot of posturing and all of that. And so that jumps into, all right, are we going to be a full-time legislature? Is that where we're headed? If we're just recessing so we can call ourselves back, or if we wanted to pass policy, which we didn't entirely succeed about creating our own ability to have special sessions, where is it that we are just doing that for our own personal or political purposes? And when is it truly when we really desperately need to take care of an issue in a timely fashion? Or in the case of this year, if you receive money from the federal government that has a deadline on it and it needs to be approached in a timely fashion, you can't wait till the next legislative session, then we should have been very particular that we will call ourselves back out of recess only for the sole purposes of making sure that those monies are placed where they should be and not belabor our time there. So there was a very difference of opinion in the two bodies about the need to be in recess or the need to call ourselves back in for financial budgetary reasons. And I think not putting large sideboards on when it is that we should or shouldn't operate is a mistake, because it will be abused. And so when we call ourselves back, it better be on the taxpayer. If we're not paying if it's under a certain number of days, but over a certain number of days, yes, then we end up getting our per diems and our wages regardless for doing the work. And so we should be very thoughtful and efficient when we decide to do something like that.
Senator Winder.
Thanks, Bill. Obviously, recess is for a longer period of time. If you adjourn sine die, which really is the question, sine die means you're done, it's finished, the session's over. Any legislation that was pending, any matters that were pending are dead. But by recessing, it keeps all of those issues alive. In fact, we have to publish a calendar, and even though we voted to sine die, the House did not agree. And so there is an argument that's been made, I think, by former Supreme Court Justice Jones, that because the House didn't call us back in 3 days, that they agreed to sine die as well. But that's playing out, and we're basically saying we're at recess until we figure out something else. What does it mean? It means that the House, if they determine, and it's primarily the Speaker of the House and leadership decide that there's urgent matters that need to be taken up, that they could force us to come back in a 3-day period to have a session. One of the interesting things I think you brought up was, employees voting to have their own salaries paid. They don't get overtime, but if they're in session, they get per diem. And one of the telling things that happened was when we sent the Senate resolution over to adjourn for the 6 days to allow for the veto of the governor period to lapse. The conservative caucus in the House voted against it. And we were told the reason they did that is because they expected to be paid. We think if you're not doing your work, that you shouldn't be paid. And so there was that difference of opinion between the House and the Senate. And then probably one other thing is the governor actually gave us a letter, which is, I think, pretty extraordinary of him to do it, but he actually gave us a letter saying that if he did receive a large amount of federal funds, that he would call us back into special session to deal with those funds. So I think we felt more comfortable with that promise than the House did. But in effect, we are in a recess.
Representative Rubel.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly creates some interesting constitutional gray area with the two chambers taking different paths. I actually brought a motion at the end to adjourn sine die, so we would at least know where we stand. And there are those differing views. The Attorney General says we're de facto both recessed. Jim Jones thinks we're de facto both sine died. And I have no idea. And frankly, I don't know that anybody knows unless it were to come to court and the Supreme Court were to rule. We're in no man's land. So, Yeah, it's a, it's an interesting question. You know, I guess I'm hoping that maybe the upside is we somehow come back and the House still votes on 1193, which would be nice, which was the funding for early childhood education. I don't know, maybe that's still alive since we didn't technically adjourn sine die. You know, I think probably the public would benefit from our just going home at this point. I think they've had enough of us. But moreover, there's this interesting question of the constitutional amendment on the ballot, where we are going to be asking the voters of Idaho next year whether they want to amend our constitution to allow the legislature to call itself back into session, you know, whenever they reach the certain threshold of members agreeing. I think this whole recessing gambit sort of begs the question of, why even do that? I mean, if the legislature can just recess instead of sine die and pretty much permanently preserve the ability to call itself back in whenever it wants, are we just doing an end run around that constitutional amendment process and basically reaching the desired ends in which the legislature can come back whenever it wants without having to jump through the hoop of securing voter approval on that constitutional amendment to do so?
So you're having your cake and eating it too.
Right.
So Speaker Bedke, same question to you, but also maybe if you could just, for our audience, why is the power of the legislature to call itself into session important to at least to the Republicans in the legislature?
All right, well, it's been interesting to listen to my three colleagues here. Let's emphatically clear up three things. Number one, this is not an attempt to become a full-time legislature. We are not getting paid. That the money shut off with on May 12th, to call us back in requires the presiding officer of the House of Representatives, yours truly, to do so. And so you have my assurance that it will only be in extraordinary measures, you know, under extraordinary circumstances. And if there are anything short of that, you know, then we'll have something that looks a lot like what we have right now. Why did the House do this? Why the concern? The motion to sine die is a non-debatable motion and requires a majority for passage, and we did not have the votes for sine die. I think that the reasons for that are varied. Number one, you know, there was a drumbeat back to what Senator Winters said about our friends in the Idaho Freedom Foundation. They started early and often on that drumbeat, and the rationale being that if something happens this summer like happened last summer, then the legislature would be able to call itself in the session and be in the middle, or be and then all of the decisions that would make against the backdrop of a pandemic or some other type of a declared emergency or disaster would have been made in a check and balance type of, you know, it would be through the legislative process. I don't think that in their, you know, in the legislators' hearts of hearts, they want to be obstructionist, but they truly believe that the check and balance system best serves the Idaho citizens. You would have to admit, looking back over last summer, that there were extraordinary circumstances, and there were decisions made, and laws changed, and rules changed, and rules set aside that defied the legislative process, and that is what you know, our collective action in the House would preempt in the future, that if those circumstances happened again, then the legislature would be able to call itself back in, because it's technically at recess and not at sine die. It concerns me in a couple of different ways. If you go back a few years, I was the statewide chairman leading the charge for the legislature, going to the citizens, going to, frankly, anyone that would listen, about putting into our Constitution rules review, and the ability of the legislature to always be able to do the rules review process. That's something else that went by the wayside here at the end of the session, much to my chagrin, frankly. But again, we do what we have the votes to do, and so that fell by the wayside as well. Now, that cloud had a silver lining then, and it would allow the governor to go, so that made all rules lapse, and as they will again this year, and gives everyone a chance to, all the agencies, to go through them. The governor's office had already committed to doing a full rules review of 20% every year for 5 years, and then the math says that we would have gone through all of them anyway. So I agree that this is outside of our normal practice, and a sine die is clear and with more closure. To the extent that you will admit that we are in extraordinary times, then this starts making more sense as you look at it through those lenses. Again, we don't, the legislature, we got to remember who we work for, and that's the citizens of Idaho. And I think that they expect that if we get another $1 billion outside of the ARPA deal, or in some future federal action, that the legislature be in the middle of that, as per our constitutional responsibilities. So yeah, it was outside the ordinary. Yes, there's differences of opinions out there in between the lawyers, but I think what we've done is within our prerogative. And would that it have happened a different way, frankly, personally? But I think that in a lot of ways this was foreseen by the Citizens Committee on Legislative Compensation, that allowed us to do this very thing, to recess without being paid, and we've taken advantage of that. This is not so much different than what happens every year in Congress. And not that that's an example that we should emulate, but anyway, I don't think the world will come to an end. And you have my word that it will have to be, special sessions should be special, and that should continue into the future. Again, it's not an end run to be full time. We are not getting paid. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along.
So one of our watchers, one of our audience says, will the rules go into effect without a sine die adjournment? And I don't want to spend 20 minutes on rules review, but this basically starts a process over.
Yeah, no, it makes them all be just like they were the last time. They're just all re-upped as temporary rules to be reviewed by the legislature next trip.
Okay. So we've talked. By the way, we'll get to the Idaho Freedom Foundation in a minute. Your 2 points have prompted a lot of questions from our audience, but I'm interested in the relationship between the legislature and the governor now. Yeah, you're talking about limiting some of his powers. Much of the session, some people think too much of the session was spent, arguing and re-arguing limits on his power. The conservatives in the House are very unhappy with him, and they're running a candidate against him. What is the status of the relationship between Idaho legislators and the governor today? And why don't we start with Senator Winder, and then we'll go to Senator Stennett, and then Rubel and Bedke. So, and I guess I would say, as briefly as we can.
Yeah, I would think it's our relationship with the governor has improved. I think he has been really good the last several weeks of the session to actually call us in and listen to us. We were able to work with the attorneys in his office and get some legislation passed. As you know, we agreed to some code changes, and he agreed to those. He signed all of them. He didn't veto any of them. But I think what's most important for people to understand in your audience is, yeah, he has some constitutional authorities that are given to him as the executive, but all the orders that he issued were based upon Idaho code. Idaho code is basically a delegation of the legislative authority to the executive branch to deal with emergencies. He argued that he had all these powers and that we were taking them away from him, but that's not the case. They're delegated authorities by the legislature in the state laws. But I think as I mentioned earlier, we have a letter from him on if he gets a lot of money in, he'll call us back into special session. I think that he'll do that if we have issues that we were fighting about last summer. I think he'll call a special session because he doesn't want that to happen again, I don't think. So I think we all learned how to work better together.
Senator Stennett.
Well, I alluded to some of what your question is about. I think in the end, unfortunately, Rubel and I were not in the room with the lawyers when they were determining this, but we had the opportunity to speak to the governor's office in the latter weeks about what he thinks he could negotiate and compromise with, which I think was where we all needed to be much earlier in the session, but at least we got there. We had a real concern about how political or unnimble, as I mentioned earlier, that the legislature could be in natural disasters and emergencies, and the very reason why you have the Guard and why FEMA works. And so a lot of the questions that came up during the legislature is we would be losing all of our ability to provide services and resources to the people in a timely fashion through FEMA and our Guard and our Office of Emergency Management, to the point where they were all sitting with us in the office going, whoa, 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 whoa. Do you know what you're disassembling in a real disaster here? You have to have that earnest conversation about, yeah, you want to talk about who has the power and who's say and all that, but that is a struggle of the branches of government, political branches of government. It isn't necessarily talking to what can you do with the people in the quickest, most timely fashion when they're at risk, when there is real danger. And so I understand the superfluous side of that, which was navigated through in the end about being more open with each other, about having that dialogue. But in the end, we have to understand that most all governors in some fashion or form have those powers for a reason. And we may not always agree with them. And yes, we were in extraordinary circumstances with COVID, though much of what the governor did was not mandatory. It was recommended. Now it's not required, which was a real confusion by a lot of the public. Nobody was forced to do anything. But when you're dealing with a large population, you do have to navigate to the best of your ability in uncharted waters to make everybody as safe as you can. So that is the kind of discussion that we should always be having when we're talking about who's taking in charge. Let's talk about who all we are saving in that discussion in difficult times. And I think that got very discussed during this session and needed to.
Right. He didn't order a statewide mask mandate, but he did ask for a non-voluntary quarantine in those first few weeks of late March and April. There was a stay-at-home order that was mandatory. Right.
That was non-voluntary, you're correct, and it did give it to the public health districts and the local governments instead of having it lowered down. But there was a lot of dissent about that too. You could see that there was a lot of pushback by the legislature against health districts for that very reason, right. and also against local governments for their choices, which made it a very patchwork rollout of a situation, which worked for some and didn't for others.
So Representative Rubel, anything to add to what we've already heard?
You bet. Let's see. Well, where to begin? I mean, it was an ironic session in that throughout most of the session, the Democrats in the legislature were about the best allies that the governor had, sometimes about the only allies that the governor had in terms of his actions in the COVID crisis. And, you know, from a big picture, I know that many folks were upset about the measures he took. But we're in an interesting situation with COVID where we have 50 different states who all took basically 50 different approaches to COVID. And you can look at the data and see what worked and look at the whole spectrum. And on the one end, you have South Dakota, where they just said basically like, la, 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 no pandemic happening, not going to do anything, no shutdowns, no masks. We're all going to completely go about our business as usual. And that's a very rural state where you have no public transportation, no population density, no big cities. It's a place that should have had really low COVID rates. And instead they led the nation in death rates really after the first wave. And if you take that South Dakota death rate and you apply it to Idaho, we'd have about 2,300 more dead Idahoans. And so I'm concerned that, that's where we would have been, I think, if we had tied the governor's hands in the way that some wished and prohibited any of the measures we took. And there were a lot of states that took far more aggressive measures. We were barely middle of the road. We were probably closer to the South Dakota end. But I don't know that 2,300 more dead Idahoans would be a great outcome. And I'm afraid that's what we could be looking at in future emergencies if we really tie the hands of our executive to respond swiftly and decisively in the case of emergencies. But beyond that, there were, so I think he did a decent job given the political parameters he was working within. Obviously, couldn't do the kind of things that they do in Oregon and California, but he did something. But I was very frustrated on other fronts. I think there were a number of things that he knew were bad and were going to lead us into costly and I hope losing litigation, but that he signed anyway, because I think he felt, maybe he only had so many chips to cash in on vetoes or something. But it deeply, deeply disappointing that he signed off on 1110, the bill that ostensibly eliminates ballot initiative rights. He vetoed those bills back in 2019 when the legislature tried this, and it was really unfortunate to see him crack on that front. And now we're not only in costly litigation, I guess we're paying twice, because we're paying not only the attorney general to try to take away people's ballot initiative rights, but paying a private law firm too. You look at his signing statement on that property tax bill, it read like a veto statement. It was basically like, wow, this bill is terrible. It's going to kick some people off the circuit breaker. It's going to cause havoc with local governments and emergency response services, but what the heck, I'll sign it anyway. So that was really frustrating. He's the last backstop, and I would love to see him use that power more often to stop some of those bills in their tracks. And frankly, the income tax bill, that's going to lock us in at bottom of the nation in education for a generation. That's taking not only the $400 million this year, but more than $160 million every year going forward out of the general fund. We are never going to be able to scrape ourselves out of last place in the nation on education funding with that on the books. And after he has long touted himself as the education governor, I don't know how you can stand by that while you're signing off on chopping $160 million from the fund while we're worst fitted in education in the nation. So I would have really liked to see him use his powers more to stand up for education, as he's always said he would, and stand up for property tax fairness and stand up for voters' rights. So I think there were some lost opportunities on those fronts on his part.
Speaker Bedke, what
was the question?
Where are we left? The workings of the legislature with the executive, is it poisoned? Is it good? Is it productive? Where do we stand?
Well, I think there's a couple of take-home messages here. There was, as Senator Winter pointed out, the legislature delegated power through our code for the governor to act in times of emergency or declare disasters. That no one had looked at those things for over 50 years. So regardless of all the rhetoric that we've just heard, there is a legitimate discussion to be had on how the state should react under those circumstances. Where is the line between, no one wanted to thwart the state's response in a snowmageddon type disaster or anything like unto it. Fires, floods, droughts, those types of things, business as usual. But with the larger ones, but the governor last summer had to draw on the continuity of government statutes. Those are reserved for acts of terrorism and acts of war in order to do what happened, to do what happened last summer. I don't think that that's the best way to run the railroad. And so there was a legitimate discussion to be had on each of those areas. We can talk about being nimble. A dictator is pretty nimble, and let's hope for a benevolent dictator. So nimbleness will always get in the way of checks and balances. And so, and my colleagues are very apt at pointing out and coloring everything in the darkest possible way. I think that they keep in mind that they represent 20% of the elected officials in both the House and the Senate. So I think our relationships with the governor, I think everybody learned a lot last summer. I think that the legislature learned a lot. They learned how all of the different declarations interact and what needs to be in place. So one of the very first meetings we had as a caucus, I said, okay, by show of hands, how many of you want to shut off the federal money coming into Idaho? I'm sad to say that was not unanimous, but you could count them on one hand. And so it was against that framework that no one wanted to prohibit the National Guard from helping. No one wanted to shut off the money coming in to the state of Idaho in all of the various facets of that. So I think that the governor did sit down, particularly in the last third of the session. But of course, maybe in the first 2/3 of the session, we weren't listening all that well either. I mean, I will allow for that. But we had a mutual, as good leaders do, we have a problem that we all face, and let's set aside our personal differences and let's go fix it. And I think that that's what we did there at the end. The governor signed them. Again, these were powers that were delegated to the executive branch from the legislative branch. And so it's perfectly within our prerogative to check on those things and freshen them up a little bit. And I think that that's what we did. And, the governor has a job to do. The legislature has a job to do. The presiding officers of the legislature have jobs to do. And we do them, and there's built-in friction there. Let's hope that it's creative friction, creative tension at the best, or all out, conflict at the other end of the spectrum. But I think that, we all learned some things, and I think that the pieces of legislation that were passed are common sense based and will serve us going forward.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and we have several questions about the initiative process, a couple questions about the redistricting process, and several questions about the IFF. And so we're not going to be able to get to all of them in the time we have allotted. But these are questions directed specifically to Bedke and Winder. Don't you think the onerous restrictions on the initiative process are also a threat to our democracy? Haven't you made it as difficult as humanly possible to get an initiative on the ballot? Why are citizens being cut out of the process? So I would say, let's give you a chance, Senator Winder, and then Senator Bedke. And then if we have time, I'd like to ask a couple other quick questions.
We have to remember Idaho is still a rural state, and most of our communities are quite small. When you get out into the area away from Boise, there are a lot of people that are represented in the legislature that felt that they needed to have some say in the initiative process as to what got on a ballot. And that as the population grew and grew in the urban areas, that it took away some of their ability to have a say in the future of the state, other than to just go vote on something in November. So I think that was probably the greatest motivator for the Senate. At least that's my understanding of why my colleagues supported it, was basically supporting rural Idaho and the nature of our state.
Speaker Bedke, anything to add?
Remember that approximately half the states have no initiative or referendum process, and Idaho is one that does, and it's something that is constitutionally protected. We'll see where the limits are of that as we proceed. Having said that, the initiative process or the referendum process is a legislative process. And so when the citizens as a whole are going to act as the legislature, then I think that there should be more than just half of the legislative districts represented in that process. And yeah, we can say, well, yeah, we'll get it, and they can vote on it in November. But as Senator Winder said, that the process starts way before that, and many legislative districts felt left out of that process.
So both of you, Speaker Bedke and President Winder, have referenced the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and several questions essentially ask, what can you do to reduce the influence of of that organization. And then someone specifically says, would like to hear from the speaker about why he held the early childhood bill S 1193 in response to the impact of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. So the Speaker Bedke and then Senator Winder.
Well, we are elected by our constituents and not by third parties. And so I think that that's where our sacred relationship, sacred devotion is back to the constituents and not to give our votes to anyone. I am a cattle rancher. I'm steeped in agriculture and agricultural policy and things like that. But I do not owe the Idaho Cattle Association my vote, nor do I give it to them blindly. And so I think that that's where that's where my concern is that that the sacred relationship between constituent and elected official is usurped to a degree. But again, the citizens send us 70 House members each session, or every 2 years, and 35 senators. And it's not, as legislative leaders, it's, we don't second guess that. We work with who is sent to us, and we don't, and another principle is we don't question each other's votes. However, how you vote is between you and your constituents, and how I vote is between me and mine. And so what is happening, if anything is happening, must be okay with a group of constituents, because they elect who they elect. That's their first choice of all the people, all the 48,000 people that live in each one of these districts, the people that they send, that we have to deduce that is their first choice to represent their interest in Boise. And the rest of us need to respect that as well. And so, so that makes it hard at times. And, I'll knit this back into S 1193. That died on a tie vote. You saw anyone that was watching the House on any types of reconsideration through the session, though the vote count was never the same. The votes always failed when it came to reconsideration, and there was simply not the votes nor the willingness to advance the Senate Bill 1193. While you may have noticed, I voted for it the first time, but we did not have the opportunity to vote for it again. But that was the collective will of the majority caucus.
Well, is it possible
Bill,
it'll come back? It'll be come
could
back.
I answer real quick?
Yes, just a second. Speaker Bedke, is there a chance that bill could get considered if you do call the House back into session?
If it's determined that we are in recess and not in a state of sine dead, then everything that was on the calendar is on the calendar, as it would be when we recess for the weekend or recess for a 2-week break in pandemic, or insert your example here.
It sounds like you're dodging my question.
Yeah, I believe that we are in recess. I don't dodge your questions. I answer the questions you should ask. The 1193 is alive if we're in recess.
Okay. Senator Stennett, very quickly, and then I'll go back to Chuck.
It sounds like the Wi-Fi is working in Ketchum again. Let's hear it.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to point out that the speaker mentioned a couple of things. He said that we're only 20% of the legislature, but if you truly are elected by your people, you deserve to be heard and not silenced regardless, and that you deserve to be part of the process. And if that's the true meaning, then the 20 to 30% who are IFF legislators, who are driving a large part of the agenda, have so much power, then we should question why it's okay for one section to have an overwhelming amount of power in the legislature, and how is that the tone is, and the other one should be silenced. So I would just say we all get elected we are elected in the voice for all our people, not just our parties, at least we should be. And therefore, regardless how small people may think that we are, not being participants in it and not having a voice is not okay. And IFF legislators get plenty heard. So I think the ideas that we're all going to be able to talk on our platform, we should have equal representation to do so.
And
Thank
Bill,
you for
can I
that
also
opportunity.
pipe up quickly?
If you can do it very quickly.
Yes, I just wanted to respond to some of Senator Winder's comments on the ballot initiative bill, because there were 9 districts that they did not secure the signatures in for Medicaid expansion, but that passed Medicaid expansion by a substantial amount. I feel that the opposite thing is happening here, but essentially what they've done is they've created a system where no ballot initiative can ever get on the ballot again. There is no way. You will not find one person in the state of on a citizen-driven ballot initiative who will tell you it is even remotely possible to do under the standard Senator 1110. So we've essentially blockaded the process, which means even rural districts won't be able to get issues they want on the ballot.
All right, I want to get back to Senator Winder
Yeah, let me
on
just respond to
you brought up the Freedom Foundation and its influence, and
Right.
several questioners want to know what you plan to do about it.
Well, let me talk about just what Representative Rubel just said. There are states that require for initiatives that they have to have ballots from all the congressional districts. So everybody is involved. I think there's a real effort to say it can never happen. I'll bet you it happens again, even with the restrictions that they say are the restrictions. We think it's helping the rest of Idaho have a say. But let's go to your other question.
So,
Idaho
right,
Freedom Foundation.
Freedom Foundation. What you brought it up.
Right, and I brought it up and I specifically said that as my greatest disappointment because they are driving the agenda. They are attacking members of this body if you don't agree with them, and becoming more and more aggressive. When they first started, they were more of a think tank and presented their policies. Went in and worked on ideas and countered other people's ideas. Now they are very aggressive in going after everybody. Their rating system is their rating system. It's not a true conservative rating system. I would say it's probably more libertarian than it is Republican. And I think that that's the biggest challenge we're having is it's moved so far to the right that that's the only thing you hear about. And yet the people like myself that are pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, reducing taxes, we're called the rhinos, even though we're conservative. So it's an interesting situation we have going on in the state. And what we can do about it is I think there needs to be other groups that actually get together and support those legislators that are more in line with their thinking and not just at the ballot box. They've got to be able to come and during the sessions be vocal, send the thousands of emails we get from the ultra conservatives, counter those. Because I think if you don't, you're just going to see it continue to move more and more towards the extreme right.
We've reached 1 o'clock. I'm going to ask one last question, go a couple minutes too long. Several people have asked about, the situation with higher ed. Please speak to the treatment of higher education in general at this session and the critical race theory at a BSU course that has been determined by Holly Troxell to have no foundation. So I think, we have this proximate case, but we also have this larger tension in the state with Boise State and some of the other universities. Is that relationship poisoned? How do we move ahead in a state where we know higher education is so important? And as I look at my screen, I see Stennett, Rubel, Bedke, and Winder. So why don't we go in that order, please?
I think it was. I think it defies words what happened to higher education this year. It is the course study that was lambasted during the legislative session was extraordinarily skewed. All of our universities had an element of social justice, of learning about all parties, about being broad in your thinking, putting it into your platform. As far as for good debate and discussion instead of one type of thought pattern. I think that's important in our environment. to restrict it to look like something very homogeneous, not allow for that discussion, to the broad discussion, because all the students there come from all walks of life and all persuasions. And therefore, I think, again, another element of where all of it needs to be have an earnest discussion about it. I think that's where learning institutions are supposed to be doing that, understanding that they have their fixed curriculums that they are required to do also. It was a very strategic to be targeting BSU instead of the other universities, even though how the budget rolled out was punitive to all of them. And we have had a consistent length of time where we have not adequately funded our higher education, and that will be an extraordinary disservice to us going forward.
Rubel.
Yeah, as I said in my opening, it was really stunning that with the amount of money we had this year and the surpluses and the amount in our rainy day fund, that we ended up cutting the budgets to higher ed. Really awful situation. I mean, these are the economic engines of our state more than anything else. I saw a study that every dollar spent on BSU, every public dollar yields $8 in payback to the economy, and $32 if you count the contributions of BSU alumni. It is what brings businesses. It's the main driver of our workforce, and that we would be cutting it when we have more than enough money is stunning. I think what happened here is I think there's a group that just, including the Freedom Foundation, that just doesn't like public education. They don't think there should be public education. They think it should all be privatized. And they particularly have had their targets set on higher ed. There's a group that votes against the higher ed budget absolutely every year, and they come up with a new reason every year. And this year, I think they came up with critical race theory and hoped they could get enough people to go along with them, using this canard in my mind, to defund higher ed, and it worked. And I'm not surprised at all that the whole thing was debunked. And frankly, I don't see why we shouldn't be talking about critical race theory. Why should there be any taboo on any topic and any theory in our higher institutions, much less something that is so front of mind and so important to the national dialogue? We should be having open dialogues on all topics in our universities, and we should not be muzzling them, and we certainly should not be cutting their funding. And I certainly hope we see it play out very, very differently next year.
Speaker Bedke.
Again, we do what we have the votes to do. And I think that there's the restating of the value system that happened in 377 or House Bill 377. That has become vilified and become stereotyped. Take a moment, everyone, and stop and read that. I mean, it reiterates that we are to respect the dignity of others and acknowledge the right to express differing opinions and defend intellectual honesty, etc. This is, I appreciate the efforts that happened this last year. Again, the good news is that there was a lot of federal money that came in and that will more than displace any of the cuts that happened to any of the institutions of higher learning. That my colleagues, I get it that that's not an excuse, but I think that we've got to be careful where we send public dollars and how we use public dollars, and the reiteration of we're going to teach our kids how to think instead of what to think is good. No one has led their life in a more pro-education way than we have in our family and tried to emphasize with each of our kids. And I want them to know about, I don't know where I have been my whole life, but I didn't know about the Tulsa issues in 1921. That's phone.
I think that was a signal. You have to stop talking.
All right, I will stop talking, but I think that all subjects we need to explore. We need to know what it's like to be on the other side of issues, be on the other side of the table, and to explore those deeply and profoundly. That's what education is all about. And I defend our institutions of higher learning, and we do the best we can with the votes we have to work with each and every session.
So Senator Winder, where do we leave, and this will be our last answer to our last question, where do we where do we end up in the relationship between the people with the money and the institutions that are charged with spending that money to educate, Idaho's, future workers, future leaders? And I see that you're still on mute.
Yes, Bill, I think that, the speaker mentioned 377. That was basically a statement of all people are equal and no one should be discriminated against, which I think are the basis. I think there was fear that the critical race theory was allowing for prejudice of every person that didn't agree with you. We all know what's been going on with political correctness, and if we disagree in any way, all of a sudden we're a bigot or a racist or whatever. We don't think there's a place for that in education. I think the 2.5 million that was actually talked about was more of a message to the students in particular, and perhaps educators. But I think there's a culture in higher education. I lived through the Vietnam War. I was a student during that time period. I saw it a lot then, where all of a sudden a group can come in and take over a perspective. And I think we were starting to see that potentially in critical race theory. We certainly ought to be able to talk about race issues, but I had members of the African-American community in Boise call me and were concerned that what progress had been made may be negated by this. They wanted to look for ways to work together and keep moving forward on civil rights and racial equality in the community. And so I think there needs to be a balancing here. So I think when it comes down to money, the message was sent. It's probably less than 0.1% of their total budgets, so it doesn't have a significant impact. But I think it did send a message that we need to look at it. I had another friend call me and say that in one of the high schools in the area that there was racial discussion in the opposite direction going on. And so I think it's an issue we need to continue to deal with. It didn't get resolved with the election of the first African-American president. I think we all had our hopes that maybe that would create some of the healing we needed in our country. But this is still an open wound, and we've got to figure out a way as legislators, as community leaders, as citizens, of how best to advance civil rights for people and to protect the rights of everybody in our culture.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. We could go on for another hour, at least, given the questions we have and the engagement that we have from our audience. So I'm so appreciative of the four of you for joining us and making this conversation so lively. We have been speaking with the minority and majority leaders of the Idaho Legislature. This has been a City Club of Boise virtual discussion. And we're done. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you again to our speakers for being with us, and have a great day. See ya.